Orson Krail rode up to the Merren homestead on a Tuesday morning like he owned it, because in his mind he already did. He didn't knock. He never knocked. He swung down from his horse, walked straight to the door, and kicked it open so hard the hinges screamed. Eliza Merren spun around from the stove, and before she could speak, Krail grabbed the iron pot from her hands and hurled it across the room like it was nothing. Soup hit the wall. The pot clanged to the floor. He leaned into her face, close enough that she could smell the tobacco and contempt on his breath. "Your husband is dead," he said, "and dead men don't own land. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The cabin on Blackthorn Ridge had been empty for 11 years, and it showed. The front step had rotted through on one side. The roof sagged in the middle like an old man's back. The chimney was cracked from frost heave, and whoever had last lived there had left a rusted trap hanging above the door. Not for decoration, not for any practical purpose anyone could figure. Just hanging there, swaying in the November wind like a bad memory. Gideon Rusk stood at the base of the trail and looked up at all of it. He was 40 years old, and he looked it, not in a broken-down way, but in the way of a man who had spent 2 decades outside in all weather and never once thought to complain about it. His face was windburned and deeply lined. His hands were scarred across the knuckles from trapping and timber work, and at least 2 fistfights he preferred not to think about. He carried a rifle, a pack that weighed close to 70 pounds, and a small leather satchel that held, among other things, a folded county deed and $1 silver. That dollar was the price he had paid at the county seat 3 days ago. $1, for the loneliest piece of land in the northern Rockies. The county assessor had laughed when Gideon slid the coin across the desk. "You know there's no road up there," the man said, "and no neighbors worth speaking of, and the trail washes out every spring." He paused. "And there was a fella who tried to win up there 6 years back. Found him in March." "I know," Gideon said. "Well," the assessor pushed the deed across and pocketed the dollar. "Your funeral." Gideon had not bothered to explain that he wasn't looking for comfort or company or a future. He was looking for a place where nobody would be looking for him. After 20 years of trap lines that stretched from Montana down into Wyoming, after seasons of working other men's claims and drinking too much in too many towns he couldn't remember afterward, he had decided that the only thing he wanted was silence. His father's cabin, rotted and ruined as it was, sat at the top of a ridge that no reasonable person would bother to climb. That was the entire appeal. He started up the trail. It took him most of the morning. The path was worse than he remembered, overgrown with scrub pine and broken across 2 places where runoff had carved it up. He slipped twice on loose shale, caught himself both times, and kept moving without stopping. The wind picked up as he climbed, and by the time the cabin came into full view, his ears had gone numb and his breath was coming out in hard white clouds. He stood outside the door for a moment, looking at it. The latch was frozen. He pulled his knife and worked the ice loose, then put his shoulder against the wood and shoved. The door swung inward with a groan, and a rifle barrel came up from the dark interior and stopped 2 inches from the center of his chest. Gideon went completely still. The rifle was an old Spencer, lever action, the kind of gun that had been common during the war, and was now considered outdated. It was held by a young woman crouched behind the remnant of the table, wrapped so completely in a buffalo robe that only her face and hands were visible. She was thin, alarmingly thin, and her eyes were enormous in the low light, and her hands were shaking. Not from fear, he realized. From cold and from something close to exhaustion. She held the gun steady despite all of it. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then Gideon said, "That gun loaded?" The woman's jaw tightened. "You want to find out?" It was a good answer. He almost respected it. He kept his hands away from his sides and let his eyes move across the cabin interior without moving his head, old habit. There was a fire in the hearth, but barely, a bedroll against the far wall. A canvas bag hanging from the ceiling rafter with a rope, the way you'd store food to keep it from animals. Not much in it from the look of the sag. I own this cabin, he said. Bought it 3 days ago at county. Prove it. Moved slowly, reached into his coat and produced the folded deed. He held it out. She didn't come forward to take it, so he set it on the floor and slid it toward her with his boot. She looked at it without lowering the rifle. That's real, she said finally. Her voice had gone quiet. Yes. She lowered the rifle. Not all the way. She kept the barrel pointed at the floor, angled so she could bring it up fast if she needed to. But the direct threat was gone. Gideon let out a slow breath. I'm Eliza Merren, she said. Gideon Rusk. I know who you are. He looked at her. How's that? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the hearth and crouched down and fed 2 small pieces of wood into the dying fire. Her movements were careful in the way of someone conserving energy because they had very little left. She straightened slowly and looked at him across the room. There are letters under the hearthstone, she said. Second one from the left. Your father left them. Something moved through Gideon's chest that he didn't have a name for. He stood in the doorway for another second, then stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The cold was already leaking back in through the gaps in the logs, but it was still better than the open wind. My father's been dead 8 years, he said. I know that too. How long have you been up here? Since October. She said it simply, like it was nothing remarkable. October was 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks alone on this ridge in a cabin with a failing fire and whatever she had managed to store in that canvas bag. What are you eating? Less than I'd like. He set his pack down. He opened it, rummaged through, and found a paper-wrapped piece of dried elk meat that he had been saving for the trail back down. He held it out toward her. She looked at it. I'm not Charity, she said. No, he agreed. You're a woman who's been up here for 6 weeks alone in November, and you're going to eat something, or you're going to fall over. Take your pick on which one happens first. A pause. Then she crossed the room and took it from his hand. She didn't tear into it the way a truly starving person might. She broke off a piece carefully and chewed it slowly, like she was making it count. That told him something about her that he filed away without comment. He pulled the hearthstone up, the second one from the left. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, were 4 letters. He recognized the handwriting immediately. He had been 10 years old the last time he had seen it, but handwriting doesn't change. His hands did something involuntary, a slight tightening around the oilcloth that he got under control before she could notice. He set the letters aside without opening them. You're going to tell me, he said, why you're actually here. Eliza sat on the edge of the bedroll and looked at him steadily. The rifle was across her knees. She had not put it down. My husband found something on this ridge, she said. Spring. Not a small one. It feeds the creek that runs all the way through the lower basin. Every rancher in the valley draws from that creek their cattle, their homesteads, everything. Whoever controls that spring controls the water. And your husband told someone about it. He told the wrong person. She paused. Orson Krail. Gideon set the oilcloth letters on the table. He had heard the name Krail twice in the last 6 months from a trapper who worked the lower valleys and once from a man at a trading post outside Cutter's Fork. Neither time had the name been attached to anything good. Cattleman, Gideon said. Cattleman, she confirmed. Owns most of the grazing claims below the ridge. Has been buying up what he doesn't own. My husband refused to sell his claim, and he refused to sign over water rights. And 3 weeks after he turned Krail down, 2 of Krail's hired men came through our land and beat him badly enough that he couldn't get out of bed. He died 11 days later. She said all of this with no change in expression, which told Gideon more about what it had cost her to get to that point than any amount of visible grief would have. I'm sorry for your husband, he said. Krail's men told me they'd come back after the snow cleared. That the claim would transfer to the county on default if I couldn't prove ownership. They thought I'd run. She looked at him directly. I needed somewhere they wouldn't follow, and I needed someone they would be afraid of. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You chose me. I chose this ridge, she said. And I spread word at 2 trading posts and a supply store near Cutter's Fork that the Rusk cabin on Blackthorn was coming up for county sale. I knew you'd been seen in the northern ranges. I figured you'd hear about your family land and come to it. A pause. I was right. The fire popped. A cold draft moved through the gap under the door. Gideon looked at the woman sitting across from him with a near-empty food bag, a rifle she had held on him with shaking hands, and 6 weeks of survival on a mountain behind her, and he felt something that was mostly anger, and maybe, buried under it, something that wasn't. "You manipulated me," he said. "Yes," she said. She didn't apologize. He stood up. "I ought to walk back down this mountain right now." "You could," she said. "But there's a storm coming." You felt it on the trail, that pressure in the air. "It'll close the ridge by morning." He had felt it. He had been ignoring it because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that he was already stuck. Fuskuk. "You could have written me a letter," he said, even though he was aware of how stupid that sounded. "I didn't know where you were. Nobody did." She broke off another piece of the elk meat and chewed it. "Your father knew, though. He wrote about it in those letters." Gideon looked at the oilcloth on the table. "He knew where I was?" "Read them yourself." She lay back on the bedroll and pulled the buffalo robe over herself without another word, leaving him standing in the middle of the cabin, with the letters and the dying fire and the sound of wind that was already starting to build outside. He fed the fire first. He was angry about being maneuvered, but he was not stupid enough to let them both freeze while he stewed over it. He brought in wood from the small stack under the eaves barely enough, he noted, for another 4 or 5 days, and got the hearth burning properly. And then he sat on the floor near it with his back against the stone, and he opened the first letter. His father's handwriting moved across the page, in the uneven loops of a man who had learned to write later in life and never quite smoothed it out. The letter was dated 6 years ago. "Gideon, I don't know if anyone will ever find this or get it to you. I don't know if you're still alive. I've asked at the trading posts every spring for 3 years, and the most I ever got was a man who said he thought he'd seen someone matching your description on a trap line near the Clearwater. That could be you, or it could be any of 100 men. I want you to know I was wrong to say what I said the day you left. You know what I'm talking about. I've thought about it every year since." He stopped reading. The fire crackled. Eliza's breathing from across the room had gone slow and even. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in the oilcloth and set it near the hearth where it would stay dry. He would read the rest later, or not at all. He hadn't decided. Outside, the wind had climbed 2 registers higher. It was moving through the timber now with that particular sound, a low, sustained moan that meant it was bringing something serious with it. He got up and checked the door and the window shutters and found 2 of them loose, and spent 20 minutes tightening them by firelight with the only tools available in the cabin, which were a bent nail in the back of his knife handle. He slept badly on the floor. Not because of the cold, he'd slept in worse, but because his mind kept turning over things that had no easy answers. By morning, the ridge was sealed under 18 inches of new snow, and the trail was completely gone. He stood at the door and looked out at it, and felt Eliza come to stand beside him. "You knew this would happen," he said. "I hoped it would," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Not much of one." He turned back inside. "We're going to need more wood," she nodded. "There's a deadfall about 100 yards north. I found it in October but couldn't move the timber by myself." "Show me where." She looked at him with something in her expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief. It was more complicated than either. She pulled on her coat, wrapped a length of wool around her face, and led him out into the snow without further comment. The next 2 weeks were the hardest kind of practical. Gideon cut wood. He repaired the most dangerous gaps in the cabin walls with pine pitch and packed bark. He hunted. Not every day, because the storm moved through in phases, and there were stretches where going out meant risking real trouble, but enough that their food situation, which had been genuinely desperate when he arrived, stabilized into something livable. Eliza recovered her strength on regular meals and proved almost immediately that she was not someone who intended to sit still while someone else worked. She patched his spare shirt, which had a tear across the shoulder he'd been ignoring for a month. She inventoried everything they had and laid out rationing that was tighter than Gideon would have managed on his own, which galled him slightly and which he didn't say anything about because she was right. She also knew the ridge in ways he didn't. He had grown up here, but he had left at 18 and not returned. The land had changed in 22 years. The creek had shifted its channel. A section of the eastern timber had grown dense enough to block sight lines he remembered as open. and a rock slide had remade the southern approach in ways that made it both more difficult and, if you knew it, more defensible. Eliza had spent 6 weeks mapping every foot of it. "You walked all of that?" Gideon asked one evening, looking at the rough sketch she had drawn on the back of a flour sack. "I had nothing else to do," she said, "and I wanted to know the land before Krail's men showed up. You were planning for that even before I got here." "I was planning for everything." She paused, looking at the sketch. "I didn't know if you'd come, or if you'd stay. I made plans that didn't depend on either." He looked at her across the table. "That's a hard way to live," he said. "Yes," she said simply. He thought about that long after she'd gone to sleep. He thought about what kind of person made plans that didn't assume anyone else would show up. He thought about whether he recognized something in that, and decided he did, and that recognizing it didn't make him feel better exactly, but it made him feel something. 3 weeks after his arrival, he finally opened the second letter. "I went back to the cabin on the ridge last summer to fix the chimney flashing. Don't know why habit, I suppose. Or guilt. I left those letters there because I had nowhere else to put them where I thought you might eventually find them. I want you to understand something about this land, Gideon. The spring on the north face, I never filed the water claim properly. I meant to. I kept putting it off. If I die before you find this, the claim is going to look unattached. Someone will come for it. Someone always comes for things that look unattached. Don't let them take it. That spring feeds 3 families in the valley. Your grandfather dug the original channel. It belongs to the land, and the land belongs to you. I was wrong to say what I said. Come home if you can." Father Gideon sat with the letter for a long time. The fire burned down to coals, and he let it, and the cabin got cold enough that he could see his breath, and he sat there anyway. He heard Eliza stir. She got up without speaking and put 2 pieces of wood on the coals and blew on them until they caught, and then she went back to her bedroll. She did not ask him what was wrong. He did not explain. In the morning, he was different in a way he couldn't fully account for. Not softer, that wasn't it. But something had shifted in him that had been in the same position for 20 years. Like a frozen hinge finally giving. He started teaching Eliza to shoot properly. She was not a bad shot. She had clearly handled firearms before, but she had the habit, common in people who had learned informally, of flinching just before the trigger. He made her dry fire the Spencer 100 times over 2 days, till the flinch stopped, and then he took her outside in a clear stretch between storms and had her shoot at a pine knot on a fence post from 40 yards. First shot went 2 inches wide. Second shot hit the post. Third shot hit the knot. She lowered the rifle and looked at him. "Don't compliment me," she said. "I know what you're going to say, and I don't need to hear it. I was going to say the trigger pull on that Spencer is 6 pounds heavier than it should be, and someone should have adjusted it years ago." She considered that. "All right, that's useful. Next time, use the Remington." He had the Remington, a rolling block 0.44, that he kept in better condition than anything else he owned. He had never offered to let anyone else touch it. He was not entirely sure why he offered it now. She took it without ceremony and immediately checked the action and sighted it toward the tree line. "Lighter," she said. "Yes, better balance, yes." "Why did you wait this long to give it to me?" He didn't answer that. She accepted the non-answer and handed it back, and they walked back to the cabin through ankle-deep snow, in a silence that had stopped feeling hostile somewhere in the last week, without either of them formally deciding to change it. A month in, Krail's name came up again, not from Eliza, but from a trapper named Boone Casper, who made a desperate push through the upper ridge during a brief weather window with a message from the valley. Boone was 60, weathered past counting, and not a man who scared easily. He was scared now. "Krail's been putting it around that the widow on Blackthorn was found dead," Boone said, sitting at the table with Gideon's real coffee, the last of it warming his hands. "Exposure," he's saying. "Natural causes. Already told 3 different families in the valley that the spring water rights are available for claim." Eliza sat across from him, very still. "He doesn't know I'm here," Gideon said. "Not yet." Boone looked at him. "But come spring, when he sends men up to stake the spring claim, they're going to find out. And Krail is not the kind of man to be embarrassed twice." A pause. "He's got 7-8 hired guns on permanent payroll. Not cowboys. Hired for exactly what you think they're hired for. How many of the Valley families does he actually control? Eliza asked. Boone turned to her. Most of them. He's bought the water claims on the east side and the grazing rights on the south. The families in the middle of the basin Harmer, Prout, the two Delancey brothers, they're the only ones holding out, and he's made their lives hard enough that two of them are thinking about selling by spring. Eliza looked at Gideon. He was already thinking through the terrain of the ridge. He knew it better now than he had at arrival. Eliza's maps had helped, and he had done his own walking in the clear stretches. He knew where a man on horseback was vulnerable, and where a man on foot who knew the ground had the advantage. He knew the eastern timber approach was the obvious route, and the obvious route was the one Krail's men would take. Let them come, he said. Boone stared at him. Son, I just told you the man has 8 professional killers on his. I heard you. Gideon picked up his coffee. This isn't their mountain. Boone left before the next weather closed in, shaking his head and looking at Gideon, the way men look at someone they're already deciding is dead. That night was the first night the tension in the cabin changed into something else entirely. It happened without either of them planning it. Eliza was working on the splice of a broken rifle strap by firelight, her hands moving with the careful economy of someone who'd repaired things all her life. Gideon was sharpening his knife, a task he could do without thinking, and watching her without exactly meaning to. She looked up and caught him. Neither of them said anything for a second. Boone was right, she said finally. You could leave. Before spring opens the trail, you could go north and disappear into the ranges and no one would find you. She held his gaze. You've done it before. I have, he agreed. I'm not asking you to stay, she said. I want to be clear about that. You owe me nothing. That's not quite right, he said. You're in this situation partly because you maneuvered me up here. I gave you the information to come of your own free will. That's a generous interpretation. Take it or leave it. He finished one side of the knife blade and turned it over. My father asked me to come back. To this land. In those letters. A pause. He asked me to keep someone from taking the spring. Eliza was quiet. I know, she said. I read them before you arrived. That's partly how I knew you'd come, if you heard about the sale. He stopped sharpening. He set the knife down and looked at her. You read my father's letters. The pause before she answered was exactly the length of a person deciding to tell the whole truth. Yes, she said. And you used what was in them to figure out how to bring me here. Yes, he stood up. He walked to the door, opened it, stood in the cold air for a solid minute, and came back inside. He sat down. He picked up the knife and began sharpening it again. You are, he said, with a slowness that suggested he was choosing words with deliberate care, the most calculating person I have ever met. Yes, she said, and your husband was lucky to have you. She did not respond to that, but her hands stopped moving over the rifle strap for a moment, and in the firelight her face did something complicated and private. The winter stretched toward February, then into March, and Blackthorn Ridge stayed buried under cold that didn't relent. The trail below remained impassable. Gideon checked it twice and came back both times shaking his head. They were up here until the thaw came, and both of them had stopped treating that as a problem somewhere around the 6-week mark. He knew the shape of her day before she said anything. She knew his. They had developed the wordless coordination of people who share a small space and have stopped trying to stay out of each other's way. When he brought in wood, she had the fire ready. When she mended, he kept the noise down. When he woke at 4 a.m. from dreams he never talked about, she didn't mention it. He started checking the eastern approach every 3 days. Not for any reason yet, but it was the direction Krail would come from, and he wanted the habit of it established before he needed it. He found the rock formation on the first check. It was a natural shelf of granite about 40 yards into the timber from the trail, positioned so that someone standing behind it could see clearly down the approach without being visible from below. He stood there for a while in the silence of the mountain and thought about what a man with experience and patience could do from that position. Then he went back to the cabin and didn't say anything about it. Eliza noticed. You found something, she said. It wasn't a question. Eastern approach has a natural anchor point, he said. Granite shelf, good sight lines. She nodded slowly. I didn't find that one, I know. You've got the south and north covered in your maps. East is messier. The timber's too dense to read from the cabin. Show me. When the weather clears, she accepted that. Then, you're planning for them to come up the east. It's the only way that makes tactical sense. The main trail is too exposed. South is too steep for horses. If Krail sends riders, they come east. And you want to be ready. I want to be past ready, he said. She studied him with the same particular attention she sometimes gave to problems she was working through. Then she said, "You've done this before, not just trapping." "Something else." He didn't answer. "You were in something," she said. "Something that taught you how to look at terrain the way you look at it. You ask a lot of questions. You answer very few of them. That should tell you something." She was quiet a moment. "You don't have to tell me, but I want you to know that whatever it was, it's useful. Not something to be ashamed of." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. And that was all. April came in cold, and then a week later came in warm, and the snowpack began its long withdrawal from the ridge. The trail reopened slowly from the bottom up. Gideon watched it every day from the eastern approach shelf, where he was now spending 2 hours each morning. One morning in mid-April, Eliza climbed up beside him. She stood at the granite shelf and looked down at the thinning snow on the approach and said nothing for a few minutes. Soon she said, "Weak." He paused. "You can still go." "No," she said, "I cannot. The cabin is in my name." "You don't owe—" "That spring fed my husband's cattle," she said, and her voice had taken on the quality of something that had been compressed for months and was now precisely, carefully controlled. "He built that water channel. He died because he wouldn't sign it away. I am not going to run." She looked at him. "If you tell me to go, I'll go. But I'll come back the moment you're not looking." He almost smiled. He didn't quite. "Stay then," he said. She nodded once. They stood side by side on the granite shelf and looked down the approach together, and neither of them said anything about what was coming, because they had already said all of it in the months behind them. The morning the first 3 riders appeared at the base of the trail, Gideon was already at the shelf. He watched them come up. They were moving confidently, too confidently, the way men move when they expect to find nothing but a frightened woman and an empty cabin. They were armed, but they hadn't pulled weapons yet. They were announcing themselves through their posture rather than through any particular threat. He came down from the shelf and walked to the middle of the trail and stood there. They saw him when they were about 60 yards out. One of them called something back to the others. They pulled up short. Then they kept coming. They stopped about 20 yards from him. The man in front was broad across the shoulders, running to fat in the middle, with a revolver on his hip and the look of someone who had used it more than once. He looked Gideon over the way you look over an obstacle. You're deciding whether to go through or around. "Krail land," he said. "No," Gideon said, "it isn't." Widow Merren's claim defaulted. "There's no default," Gideon said. "I hold the deed. County sale November 15th. You want to check it? I've got it at the cabin." The man's eyes moved to the cabin and back to Gideon. He was doing arithmetic behind his expression. "Krail's not going to be happy about this," he said. "I imagine not," Gideon said. "He'll want to talk." "Tell him where to find me." The man looked at him for a long moment, and then something in the way Gideon was standing. Not aggressive, not backing off. Just completely and absolutely still, in the way of something that had decided it wasn't going to move, worked its way through the calculation behind his eyes and change the result. "We'll be back," the man said. "I know," Gideon said. They turned their horses and went back down the trail. He watched them go, and he stood there even after they'd passed out of sight, listening to the mountains settle around him. A jay called somewhere in the timber. The creek murmured far below. Then he heard Eliza's boots on the packed earth behind him. 3 of them, she said. "Yes, he'll send more." "Yes." He turned around and looked at her. "He'll come himself next time." She held his gaze. "Are you afraid?" He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "No," he said, "not of that." She waited. "Of what then?" He looked back down the trail where the riders had gone, and then at the cabin behind her, and then at the spring that caught the morning light somewhere on the north face above them. And he said the only true thing there was to say. "Of what happens if I lose this and have nowhere left to go?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then don't lose it," she said. And she walked back to the cabin, And he stood there on Blackthorn Ridge in the April cold and understood, fully and without any comfortable evasion, that somewhere between the locked door and the letters, and the long white months of winter, the calculation had changed completely. He was no longer standing on this mountain because he had nowhere else to go. He was standing here because he didn't want to be anywhere else. That was a terrifying thing to realize. He walked back to the cabin, picked up his rifle, and started making it count. He walked back to the cabin, picked up his rifle, and started making it count. That was how Gideon described it to himself, making it count. Not preparing for a fight, not getting ready for something ugly, but converting the time they had left into something that might keep them alive. It was the only frame he had ever found useful when the situation was bad, and the options were few. He started that same afternoon. The eastern approach was the priority, but not the only thing that needed attention. Gideon spent 3 hours walking every route onto the ridge, the main trail from the south, the eastern timber path, the near vertical scramble on the north face that a desperate man on foot might try, and the loose shale slide on the west that horses couldn't navigate but a man alone might. He walked each one twice, once going up and once coming down, and he catalogued every choke point, every natural blind, every place where the ground shifted from advantage to liability. Eliza went with him on the second pass. She didn't ask permission. She simply appeared beside him when he started for the eastern timber, wearing her coat and carrying the Remington, which he had left on the table after the previous conversation. She had cleaned it. He noticed that immediately the action was smoother than he'd left it, the barrel wiped free of the light frost residue that accumulated in cold storage. He didn't comment on it. He just started walking. For the first half hour they moved in silence, Gideon pointing out things as they went, the sightline from the granite shelf, the depression in the trail about 40 yards below where a horse would have to slow to negotiate a rock shelf, the stand of young pine on the east side of the trail that grew thick enough to conceal a person, standing still but sparse enough at the base that anyone moving through it would snap branches. Eliza listened without interrupting. He had come to understand that this was one of her actual skills. Not just patience, but the ability to absorb information without needing to perform the act of absorbing it. She didn't nod constantly or repeat things back. She just took it in. If they come in force, he said, stopping at the granite shelf and looking down the approach, they'll send someone ahead on foot to scout. It won't be one of the main riders. It'll be someone quieter. How do you stop a quiet man? You don't try to stop him, Gideon said. You let him come. You let him see the cabin and the trail and whatever you want him to see. You control what the scout reports back. She looked at him. You've done this before. It wasn't quite a question this time. More of a conclusion. He moved on without answering. She fell into step beside him. They came around the north side of the ridge, where the spring emerged from the rock face, a steady pour of clear water that had been running since before anyone alive could remember. It had cut a deep channel through the granite over the years and dropped into a basin at the base of the rock before following the grade down toward the valley. Standing beside it, Gideon could understand immediately why it mattered. In a dry year, or in late summer when the snowmelt slowed, this spring was the difference between a working ranch and a failed one for every family downstream. Eliza crouched beside the basin and put her hand in the water. Cold, she said, always. Comes from deep in the rock. My husband measured the flow once, said it ran consistent through August, even in drought years. She stood up, wiping her hand on her coat. Krail knows that. That's why he wants it. What kind of man was your husband? She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Careful, she said finally. He was a careful man. He thought things through. He wasn't fast or loud about anything. A pause. He thought if he was reasonable with Krail, Krail would be reasonable back. He believed that about people, that if you dealt with them straight, they'd deal with you straight. She looked at the spring. He was wrong about that one. Most careful men are. She glanced at him. What does that mean? It means careful and cautious aren't the same thing. Careful men reason their way to conclusions. Cautious men plan for the conclusion being wrong. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the basin. Your husband reasoned. He should have planned. That's a hard thing to say about a dead man. It's a harder thing to watch happen and not say anything afterward. She looked at him steadily. He held it. You're right, she said finally. He should have planned. I told him that. He didn't listen. She turned and started back toward the cabin. Most careful men don't. He followed her, and the spring ran behind them, and the mountain held its particular silence that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with waiting. The three riders Gideon had turned away did not return that day or the next. He expected that. Krail was not a man who made impulsive decisions, based on everything Boone Casper had said and everything the situation itself implied. He would need to assess what his men had reported. He would want to know who Gideon Rusk was, whether the deed held up under scrutiny, and what resources he was working with on the ridge. That assessment would take time, and the time would be used on Gideon's end to make the ridge into something Krail hadn't planned for. He began with the eastern approach. Over 4 days he made small adjustments to the terrain that were individually meaningless and collectively significant. He moved 3 large deadfall logs to new positions, not blocking the trail, which would announce preparation, but narrowing the effective width at 2 points where horses would already be moving carefully. Cleared the brush from behind the granite shelf and found that the natural depression behind the formation was deeper than he'd realized, enough for 2 people to stand upright and be completely invisible from anyone on the trail below. He checked the rock shelf on the main trail, the one where horses had to slow. He spent an afternoon on it with a cold chisel he found in the cabin's old workshop. His father's chisel, handle wrapped in dried leather, and enlarged a crack in the stone on the upper side of the shelf. Not enough to be obvious. Enough that a horse stepping in the wrong place would find uncertain footing. Eliza watched him work on that last one without speaking. When he came back to the cabin at dusk, she handed him a tin cup of something hot, not coffee. They'd been out of coffee since March, but a broth she made from dried herbs and salt, and said, "You're not trying to hurt the horses. No, you're trying to scatter the riders. Confused men make bad decisions," he said. And bad decisions in unfamiliar terrain cost time. Time is what I need. To do what? To be somewhere else while they're busy being confused. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. And me? You stay at the cabin. I told you. I know what you told me, he said. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be at the cabin, with the door open, where anyone coming through the timber from the north can see you. If they're watching us, I want them watching you, not me. She thought about that. You want them thinking you're the threat they have to deal with, she said slowly, while you're already behind them. Something like that. What if someone comes at the cabin directly? He pulled the Remington from his pack and set it on the table in front of her. Then the rifle is for that, he said. She looked at it. She looked at him. I'm not going to sit behind a door and listen, she said. I know, that's why I'm not asking you to. He sat down. If someone comes at the cabin, you don't wait for them to knock. You go out the back window to the woodpile, and you take the high ground behind the storage shed. From there, you've got a clear angle on anyone crossing the yard. She was quiet. You've thought about this a lot, she said. Since April. Since before those 3 men came up the trail. Yes. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. Gideon, why are you doing this? He looked at her. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said. You could have shown those men the deed and asked them to carry it back to Krail and waited to see if the legal claim held. You could have written to the county and let the official process work. You didn't have to. She gestured toward the eastern approach, toward everything he'd been doing for a week, any of this. He picked up his cup, set it down, picked it up again. The legal process works for men who can wait it out, he said. Krail has money and hired lawyers and friends at the county seat. You said it yourself. He's been buying claims for years. He knows how to make official processes move in his favor. That's practical, she said. That's not an answer to my question. He looked at her. The fire was low. The light in the cabin was the color of old copper. Outside, the April wind moved through the timber with a sound that had begun, over the months, to feel familiar in a way he hadn't expected. My father wrote in those letters that the spring feeds 3 families, he said, and that his own grandfather dug the original channel. A pause. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. Krail's been in the valley for what, 10 years? 12? He set the cup down. He doesn't get to walk up here and take it because he has more hired men than I do. Eliza was quiet for a long time. That's a personal reason, she said. Yes, not just practical. No, something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition of something she had suspected but hadn't been certain of. All right, she said. And that was all. But it wasn't all, and both of them knew it. It was 10 days after the first riders left that Boone Casper appeared on the ridge again. He came up in the early morning when the light was still gray, moving fast for an old man, and he knocked twice on the cabin door in the pattern Gideon had told him to use. Gideon had the door open before the second knock was finished. Boone came inside, looking over his shoulder. He was breathing hard, and his face was the color of old ash. He's coming, Boone said. Krail. Not sending men this time. Coming himself with 8 riders. I counted the horses at the livery in Cutter's Fork last evening. He accepted the cup of water Eliza brought him and drank half of it in one pull. He's coming up the east trail. Day after tomorrow, maybe the morning after that, depending on the weather. How do you know it's the east trail? Gideon asked. Because he asked the liveryman about the condition of the eastern timber route. Whether horses could handle the upper section. Boone put the cup down. He's not asking about the main trail. He's asking about the approach he thinks you won't be watching. Eliza and Gideon looked at each other. 8 riders, she said. Plus Krail, Boone said. So 9. He paused. I'm not telling you to run. I'm just telling you what 9 men looks like, in case you haven't thought about it lately. I've thought about it, Gideon said. And it changes the shape of things without changing the thing itself. Boone looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Eliza. Then he looked at the ceiling. I'm too old for this, he said, mostly to himself. You don't have to be any part of it, Eliza said. You've done more than enough. Boone made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. If I weren't part of it, I wouldn't be standing in your cabin at 6 in the morning drinking your water. He stood up. I'll be back down the ridge before the weather changes. If anyone asks, I was checking trap lines. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Gideon, you remember what you said to me last time? That this isn't their mountain, I remember. You better be right about that. He opened the door and went back out into the gray morning without waiting for a response. They listened to his footsteps on the frozen ground until they faded. 9, Eliza said. 9 on horses, Gideon said. Coming up terrain they don't know, led by a man who's used to paying other people to do the hard part. You make it sound manageable. It's not manageable. It's a bad situation. He turned to look at her. But bad situations have edges. You find the edges. What are the edges here? He sat down at the table and she sat across from him, and for the next 2 hours they worked through it. Not a plan. Exactly plans assumed things would go as predicted, and Gideon had never once in his life seen a conflict go as predicted. But a set of principles, a set of positions, a set of decisions that had already been made before the shooting started, so that neither of them would be making decisions while scared and under pressure. The riders came up the east trail. Gideon would be on the granite shelf. If someone broke from the group early and moved toward the cabin on the north side, Eliza would see them from the woodpile position. If the horses spooked on the rock shelf, which Gideon believed they would, the riders would be split before they reached the timber approach. If Krail himself stayed back while his men went forward, Gideon would let him. A man who stays back is a man who hasn't committed yet. The goal was not to kill anyone. He said that plainly, and she received it without argument. The goal, he said, is to make this ridge more expensive than it's worth. Krail is a businessman. Businessmen make decisions based on cost. You make the cost high enough, you change the decision. And if he doesn't change the decision, then we make the cost higher. She nodded slowly. And the spring is the whole point. If he can't take the spring, he loses the leverage he has over the valley. Gideon leaned forward. We need the valley families to know what this is about. Not just that Krail is trying to take land. They already know that. They need to know that the spring is the center of it, and that if he gets the spring, he gets control of all their water. Boone can carry that, she said. Boone is already carrying enough. He won't care. She picked up the empty water cup and turned it in her hands. The Harmer family, Thomas Harmer, has 2 daughters who married into the Delancey line. They're all connected. If Thomas Harmer understands what losing the spring means, the Delanceys will know within a day. You know these families. I lived in this valley for 7 years. She set the cup down. I know who talks to whom. I know who holds grudges and who extends credit and who owes what to whom. She paused. My husband knew it too. He just didn't use it. You're going to use it. If you'll let me send a message through Boone before he gets too far down the ridge. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Go, he said. She was already moving before he finished the word. He heard her boots on the frozen ground outside, moving fast, and then her voice calling Boone's name across the open stretch between the cabin and the tree line. Pause, then Boone's answer. Then the two of them speaking in voices too low to make out from inside. He used the time to check the Remington and the Spencer and his own rifle, and to do the accounting of ammunition that he'd been doing in his head every day since March. The numbers were what they were. They were enough if this went the way he'd calculated. They were not enough if it went worse. He had no contingency for worse. He had decided, somewhere in the past 10 days, that a contingency for worse was a concession to losing, and he wasn't going to make that concession. It was possibly the least rational decision he'd made in 40 years of mostly rational decisions, and he was at peace with it in a way he couldn't entirely explain. Eliza came back inside 10 minutes later, cheeks red from the cold. Done, she said. Boone, he'll talk to Harmer tonight. Harmer will talk to the Delanceys. She unwound the wool from her neck and hung it on the peg by the door. They're not going to fight for us. I'm not asking them to. But if Krail's men come off this mountain and try to file a spring claim at the county seat, there will be 3 fans waiting to contest it with documentation my husband kept. She met his eyes. He kept records of everything. Every measurement, every conversation, every offer Krail made and what he said in response. I have those records. Gideon stared at her. You've had those records this whole time. Yes. And you didn't. He stopped. Where are they? In the canvas bag on the rafter. She said it simply. Under the dried meat. He looked at the bag. He looked back at her. You have legal documentation of Krail pressuring your husband to sell, and you didn't tell me. I told you what you needed to know when you needed to know it, she said, with no particular defensiveness. You needed to decide whether to stay because of the land and your father's letters. Not because I had paperwork. Why does it matter why I decided? Because I need to know if you'll still be here in a week, she said. Her voice was level, but something underneath it was not. A man who stayed for land might leave if the land becomes too costly. A man who stayed for his own reasons is harder to move. He understood that. He understood it more than he wanted to. I'm not leaving, he said. Good. She moved toward the stove. Then let's eat something, because tomorrow we're going to spend the whole day on the eastern approach, and I am not doing it hungry. He almost said something. He decided against it and got up to help. The next morning they were on the ridge, before the sun had fully risen, and what they did in the hours that followed was the most methodical work Gideon had done in years. Not because it was physically complicated, it wasn't, but because it required both of them to hold the shape of the whole plan simultaneously while working on each individual piece of it. He showed her the granite shelf in full, walking her through every angle. He showed her how to move from the shelf to the depression, behind it to the timber on the north in a sequence that took less than 40 seconds if you knew where to step. He showed her where the deadfall logs would channel any horse that spooked left on the approach, and how the narrowed trail width at the second choke point would mean riders had to slow to single file. She absorbed it, and then she improved it. She identified a position he hadn't considered. A low shelf of rock on the south side of the trail, invisible from below, but accessible from the cabin by a route through the timber that she had memorized in October and he hadn't mapped yet. From that position, anyone moving up the main trail would have their flank exposed. I didn't find this, he admitted. I told you's map the south, she said, without the smallest trace of satisfaction. Just fact. If someone comes up the main trail while I'm on the east approach, then I'm here, she said. That's not what I planned. I know. She looked at him from the low shelf eye level with the trail. But it's better. He stood there for a moment with the particular internal friction of a man who is right about being wrong. Don't take risks you don't have to, he said. I won't take any you wouldn't take, she said. He didn't have a good answer for that. He moved on. By the time they came back to the cabin that evening, both of them were exhausted in the specific way of people who have been thinking hard all day in cold air. They ate without talking much, and the quiet between them had taken on a different quality than it had in the early winterless guarded, less calculated, more like the silence of two people who had run out of things to keep from each other. Almost. She was the one who broke it. "Tell me something that has nothing to do with Krail or the Ridge," she said. He looked up from his plate. "Like what?" "Anything. Tell me something about where you've been. Something that happened." He turned the fork in his hand. "I was up near the Clearwater River 8 years ago," he said. "First hard winter after my father died, though I didn't know he'd died yet. I had a trap line that ran about 16 miles and I was checking it alone, which was stupid because I turned an ankle on the second day and spent 3 days in a snow shelter waiting for the swelling to go down enough to walk. What did you think about?" "Nothing worth repeating." "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about whether I'd made any decisions in my life that were genuinely mine," he said slowly, "or whether I'd just been moving away from things. My father, the places where people knew me, everything that asked something of me." He paused. "Took me 3 days in a snowbank to admit I didn't have a good answer." Eliza was watching him. "What did you decide?" she asked. "That it didn't matter anymore," he said. "That whatever I'd been doing up to that point, I was still alive and the ankle was going to heal, and there was still a trap line to check." "That's practical," she said. "Yes." And not an answer. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She looked at him across the table. "You're answering it now," she said. "Being here. This is an answer." He didn't say anything. "I know you didn't plan it," she said. "I know I maneuvered you up here, and the storm closed the trail, and none of it was what you chose. But you've been choosing it every day since January." She held his gaze. "That's not nothing, Gideon." He put the fork down. "No," he said. "It's not." Outside, the wind moved through the timber with that sound he had come to know as well as his own heartbeat. The fire was low and needed tending. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular dry cold smell of mountain air coming through the gap under the door that he still hadn't fixed completely. He got up to tend the fire, and she cleared the plates. And neither of them said anything else that night, but the thing that had been carefully held at a distance between them since November had moved, without fanfare, one step closer. 2 nights later, just before dawn, he lay awake listening to the mountain and understood that the riders would come tomorrow. He couldn't explain how he knew. It was something in the quality of the air, in the way the wind had dropped in the last hour, in the particular stillness that sometimes preceded a change. He had felt it before other things. Not always correctly. Correctly enough. He got up quietly and went to the door and opened it, and stood in the cold looking east. The timber was dark. The trail below was invisible in the pre-dawn. Eliza's voice came from behind him. "Tomorrow," she said. She wasn't asking. Probably. She came to stand in the doorway beside him. She was wrapped in the buffalo robe, her hair loose, and she looked at the darkness east of the ridge with the same expression she brought to everything she looked at, hard concentrated, already calculating. "I'm not afraid," she said, and then after a pause, "But I want you to know something." "Tell me." "I didn't plan this far," she said. "October, November, I planned everything. I planned how to find you, how to make you come, how to survive the winter, what to do about Krail. I planned it all." A pause. "I didn't plan past the fight." He looked at her. "Neither did I," he said. She held his gaze in the darkness. "Maybe that's all right," she said finally. "Maybe," he agreed. They stood there together in the doorway of the cabin, looking east into the dark timber of Blackthorn Ridge, and neither of them went back to sleep. The dawn came in slow and colorless, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself so much as simply arrive, gray pressing in from the east without warmth or drama. Gideon had not gone back inside after they stood in the doorway together. He had pulled on his coat and walked the perimeter of the cabin yard in the dark, checking things that didn't need checking, burning off the particular restlessness that came before something you couldn't stop from coming. Eliza made food. He could smell it from outside cornmeal, salt pork, the last of the dried onions she'd been rationing since March. She didn't call him in. She left the door open and let the smell do it, which was either practical or kind, and with her it was usually both at the same time. He came inside and ate standing up. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine. You're going to be on your feet all day." "Sit down and eat like a person." He sat down. He ate. The food was better than it had any right to be given what it was made from, which he had stopped, being surprised by somewhere around February. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "Some." She sat across from him with her own plate, eating with the deliberate steadiness of someone fueling a machine. "You?" "No, you should have, probably." He finished and set the plate aside. "I want you on the south shelf by first light, before they'd be likely to send a scout ahead." "I know. If the scout comes up the main trail instead of the east, I'll see him from the shelf, and I'll stay still," she said. "I know, Gideon. We went through it twice yesterday." "I know we did." Then stop. She put her fork down. "You're not going to think of something new in the next 20 minutes that you didn't think of in the last 2 weeks. We've done what we can do. Now we do it." He looked at her across the table. She was right. She was frequently right about things like this, the point at which more preparation becomes its own kind of paralysis. He had known men who planned themselves into the ground and then couldn't move when the moment came. He was not going to be one of them today. "All right," he said. "Good." She picked up her fork and finished her food. They cleaned up without speaking, the way they'd learned to move around each other in the cabin over the long months. Not quite choreographed, but close. Each one aware of where the other was without having to look. He banked the fire low enough that it would hold for hours, but wouldn't throw visible smoke and volume. She checked the Remington one more time, the action sliding clean and quiet under her hands. At the door, she stopped. Gideon, he was pulling on his pack, rifle already in hand. "What?" She looked at him for a moment. Whatever she had been going to say, she changed it. "Don't do anything I'd have to explain to Boone," she said. He almost smiled. "Not quite. Same to you." She went out the door and turned south, moving into the timber without looking back. He watched until the trees closed around her, then turned east and started for the granite shelf. The morning air was sharp enough to make his eyes water. He moved carefully on the trail, avoiding the loose patches of shale that would carry sound downhill. He had walked this route enough times in the past weeks that his feet knew where to go without his full attention, which freed him to listen. Timber was quiet. No jays this early, no squirrels, just the creak of the trees and a light wind, and the distant murmur of the creek somewhere far below. He reached the granite shelf and settled into the depression behind it. From there he could see the full length of the eastern approach, nearly 300 yards of trail winding up through thinning timber before it opened onto the ridge. The light was still flat and gray, but visibility was good. No fog this morning, which he'd been worried about. Fog would have compressed everything down to distances that made his position less useful. He checked his rifle, settled it across his knees, and waited. Waiting was the part most people were bad at. Not because they couldn't stay still. Most people could stay still when they needed to, but because the mind didn't go quiet just because the body did. The mind kept running calculations, kept revising scenarios, kept finding new things to be afraid of. Gideon had gotten better at waiting over the years by developing the habit of narrowing his attention to what was directly in front of him. The trail, the light, the sound of the wind through the pine, and refusing to let it go further than that. For an hour, there was nothing. The light changed from gray to the pale flat gold of early morning. A jay appeared somewhere in the timber uphill and called twice and went silent. The wind shifted slightly, coming from the south now instead of the east, which meant anyone approaching from below would be upwind of him. He heard the horses before he saw them. It was a subtle thing. Not hoofbeats exactly, not yet, but the collective sound of large animals moving through timber. A branch giving under weight, the jangle of tack, a snort quickly muffled as if someone had grabbed a bridle. They were trying to be quiet. They were partially succeeding. Then a rider emerged from the lower timber, alone, moving slowly on a gray horse. He was leaning slightly forward in the saddle, watching the trail ahead. Scout. Gideon had expected this. The man came up 50 yards and stopped and sat his horse and looked at the cabin, which was visible from there as a gray shape through the trees, smoke barely rising from the chimney. He sat for 2 minutes, maybe 3, looking. Then he turned the horse and went back down. Gideon stayed absolutely still and waited. 8 minutes later, they came. Not all at once. They came in a loose column of twos, Krail's hired men riding with the particular careless confidence of people who had done this kind of work before and found it generally uncomplicated. He counted them as they came up through the lower timber. 2, 4, 6 a gap, then 2 more. And then, at the back of the column, riding a big dark bay with silver hardware on the bridle that caught the morning light, a man in a dark coat who sat his horse, like someone accustomed to having things arranged around him. Krail. He was older than Gideon had pictured late 50s, heavy in the shoulders, with a white beard trimmed short and close. He rode with his hands loose on the reins, watching the trail ahead with an expression of mild professional interest. Not angry, not anxious, just a man arriving to conduct business. That expression bothered Gideon more than anger would have. Column came up through the timber, and the lead riders hit the first choke point, where the trail narrowed between the repositioned deadfall logs. The horses slowed involuntarily. The riders bunched slightly. Not dangerously yet, but the tightening had begun. Gideon let them come. 50 yards. 40. The second choke point was 30 yards from the granite shelf. When the lead horses reached it, the trail narrowed to single file, and the footing changed from hard-packed earth to the modified rock shelf, the one with the enlarged crack on the upper side. The first horse hit it and felt the uncertain footing and shied left, bumping into the deadfall on that side. The rider cursed and yanked the bridle. The second horse, crowding too close, reacted to the first one's movement and swung right, and the rider had to grab mane to stay on. Column crumpled in the middle. Men were shouting now. Horses were blowing. The carefully maintained column became a confused knot of animals and riders in a trail too narrow for confusion. Gideon stood up from behind the granite shelf, not with his rifle raised, just standing. Visible, the shouting stopped almost immediately. Horses sorted themselves out under firm hands, every face turned toward him on the shelf. He let the silence settle for a solid 5 seconds. Then he said, "That's far enough." The broad-shouldered man from the first visit, the one who had told Gideon Krail would want to talk, was near the front of the column. He had his hand on his revolver but hadn't drawn it. He was looking at Gideon with an expression that had shifted somewhat from their last meeting. "Rusk," the man said. "Where's Krail?" Gideon said. Not a question. From the back of the column, the man on the dark bay walked his horse forward between the others until he had a clear line of sight to the shelf. He stopped and looked up at Gideon with those professionally mild eyes. "I'm Orson Krail," he said. His voice was even and conversational, like a man introducing himself at a county meeting. "I understand you're holding a deed to this property." "That's right. County deed, November 15th. "That's right." Krail nodded slowly. "County deeds can be disputed, particularly when there are questions about whether the original tax assessment was properly filed." "Go ahead and dispute it," Gideon said. "You'll need the county recorder and a judge and about 6 months of process time." "I'll be here." Something moved behind Krail's eyes. Not anger, recalculation. "The spring on the north face," Krail said. "There's no registered water claim on it." "There will be by end of week," Gideon said. "I filed the paperwork with Boone Casper as witness 3 days ago." This was not entirely true. The paperwork existed but hadn't reached the county seat yet. But it existed, which was the part that mattered. Krail was quiet for a moment. "You're one man on a ridge," he said. "I have 8 men," Gideon said. "I know. And you've already lost your approach because your horses don't know this trail, and mine does. Let that sit. You came up the east because you thought it was the side I wasn't watching. I've been watching it since April." The broad-shouldered man's hand moved slightly on his revolver. "Don't," Gideon said to him quietly. The man's hand went still. Krail looked at Gideon with that steady professional gaze, and then he looked at the cabin, and then he looked at the terrain around them, at the timber, at the narrow trail, at the granite shelf with its clean sight lines, and Gideon could see him doing the math. Not emotional math, actual operational math. Men, terrain, odds, cost. "The widow Merren," Krail said. "Is she here?" "She's here," Gideon said. "She's been telling stories about my dealings with her husband." "Her husband kept records," Gideon said. "Conversations, dates, what was said, what was offered, what was threatened." He held Krail's gaze. 3 families in the valley have copies." The first real reaction moved across Krail's face. Not quite anger, something more controlled than anger. The expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground under a building he intended to buy has shifted in ways that affect the foundation. "You've been busy," he said. "Winter's long up here," Gideon said. Pause. The horses shifted. Someone's tack jingled. The jay had returned to the timber uphill and was calling again, loud and unhurried, completely indifferent to everything happening on the trail below. Then the broad-shouldered man said, "Mr. Krail, there's someone on that south shelf." He was pointing. Gideon did not look. He already knew where Eliza was. He had been aware of her position the entire time, the way you are aware of the location of something you've placed carefully and trust to stay where you put it. Krail looked south, then back at Gideon. "The widow," he said. "Yes, armed. Remington 44, Gideon said. "She's a better shot than she was in October. She's had a lot of practice." Krail looked at Gideon for a long time. Then he looked at his men, at the bunched column on the narrow trail, at the horses that were still unhappy about the footing, at the two positions above and south of them that they hadn't known about. He was a man who had made his fortune by understanding when something was costing more than it was earning. That understanding had not left him. "I want to see the deed," he said. "Come to the cabin," Gideon said, "alone." The broad-shouldered man started to object. Krail silenced him with a hand. "All right," Krail said. Gideon climbed down from the granite shelf and walked the cabin without hurrying, and behind him he heard the creak of Krail's saddle and the sound of one horse separating from the group and following him up the trail. He did not look back. He reached the cabin first, went inside, picked up the deed from the table where he'd left it that morning, and came back to the door. Krail had tied his horse to the post at the corner of the cabin, the same post Gideon's father had sunk when Gideon was 7 years old, still solid, and was standing in the yard looking at the building with an expression that might have been appraisal. Gideon held out the deed. Krail took it and read it carefully. Not quickly carefully, the way a man reads a document he's looking for errors in. Turned it over. He looked at the county seal. He looked at the date and the assessor's signature. He handed it back. "Legal," he said. "Yes. You paid $1. The county assessor thought I was buying a ruin." Krail almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but the shape of it was there. He wasn't entirely wrong. He looked at the cabin. Roof needed work. "Still does," Gideon said. "I've been busy with other things." Krail put his hands in his coat pockets and turned slightly, looking north toward where the spring emerged from the rock face. From the cabin yard you could hear it on a quiet morning. Not see it, but hear the faint, steady pour of water on stone. "That spring runs consistent," Krail said. "Measured flow through August in drought years. You know what that means for the valley." "I know. I built this valley," Krail said. It wasn't a boast. It was delivered like a fact. 15 years ago there were 4 homesteads below the ridge and a failing trading post. I brought money in. I bought claims and developed them, and built the road from Cutter's Fork. Those families you're talking to Harmer, the Delanceys, they have what they have, partly because I made the valley worth settling. Gideon said nothing. "I'm not a monster," Krail said. "You sent men to beat a farmer until he couldn't get out of bed," Gideon said. "He died 11 days later." A pause. "That got out of hand," Krail said. "That's a description," Gideon said, "not an explanation." Krail looked at him. The professional calm had developed a hairline fracture somewhere in the last 2 minutes. Not enough to call it emotion, just enough to show there was something underneath it. "What do you want?" Krail said. "You want money? I'll buy the claim." "Fair market. No, I'll go high, more than it's worth on paper." "No." "Then what? You're going to run cattle up here? Farm this ridge? You're 40 years old and you've spent 20 years alone on trap lines." Krail's voice had shifted, not hard, just direct. "What exactly are you building here that's worth dying for?" Gideon looked at him. "I'm not dying," he said, "and I'm not selling. The spring goes to shared claim. The valley families file together, and the water rights belong to everyone who needs them. Krail cattle doesn't get an exclusive." He held Krail's gaze. "The land stays mine, the deed is recorded, and your men stay off this ridge." Krail was very still. "And if I say no, then we stand on this mountain and we make your men understand what that costs them. And afterward, Eliza Merren takes her husband's records to the county seat, and every business dealing you've had in this valley for the past 4 years goes in front of a judge. Gideon paused. You've built something here. I don't want to take it apart. But I will if you make me. The stillness extended. A horse down the trail blew and shook its head, and one of the men said something low that carried up without being intelligible. The spring ran steadily on the north face, indifferent to everything. The widow's husband, Krail said. The records, complete, Gideon said. Dates, amounts, exact language. His handwriting, witnessed. He was a careful man, yes. Krail looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked up. I'll need to talk to my men, he said. Talk, Gideon said. I'll be here. Krail walked back toward the eastern trail without a word, and Gideon stood in the yard and watched him go, and kept his breathing even, and did not let himself think yet about how this could go from here, because thinking about it would change his face, and his face was what everything depended on right now. What happened next did not go the way he had planned. He heard Krail's voice down the trail low, calm, the voice of a man managing other men. He heard the broad-shouldered man respond, louder. He heard the pitch of the conversation change. And then he heard boots on the trail moving fast and not toward him. He was already moving when the shot came. It came from the south, not from the trail. From Eliza's position on the shelf. One shot, the flat crack of the Remington cutting through the morning air and rolling away down the ridge in echo. He ran. He cleared the corner of the cabin and took the south approach at a run, and came up toward the shelf and found Eliza standing on the rock with the rifle raised, not firing, watching. Below her, at the base of the timber slope, a man was down, not hit. He realized immediately, because the man was already scrambling to his feet, and there was fresh rock dust on the granite beside, where he'd been crouching, which meant she'd put the shot into the stone next to him, rather than into him. A warning shot. The man scrambled back into the timber. Gideon came up to the shelf, and Eliza lowered the rifle. He came through the timber from the northeast, she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not quite. He was trying to come around behind the cabin. He had a rifle. You had a clear shot at him. I had a warning shot, she said. You said the goal wasn't to kill anyone. He looked at her. You remember everything, he said. I was listening. She checked the Remington's action. He's gone back to the group. They'll know now that I'm not a decoration. He almost said something. He didn't. He turned and went back to the cabin yard. Krail was already there. He had come back alone, and he was standing in the middle of the yard with his hands visible at his sides. And whatever conversation he'd had with his men in the last 3 minutes had done something to his expression that Gideon couldn't quite read. One of my men tried to move on the cabin, Krail said. Without my order. I know. The widow stopped him. She could have killed him. She chose not to, Gideon said. Krail looked at him for a long moment. That's an interesting choice, he said. She's an interesting woman, Gideon said. A silence opened between them that had a different quality than the ones before it. Less strategic. More human. How many of your men follow orders when it gets hard? Gideon asked. Krail's jaw tightened slightly. Most of them, most. It's a realistic number, Krail said with an irritation that was the first genuinely unguarded thing he'd shown. Yes, Gideon agreed, it is. He let that work on Krail for a moment. A man whose crew would move independently under pressure was a man whose control of the situation was already eroding. Krail knew this. Gideon knew Krail knew it. The shared knowledge of it changed the shape of the conversation. I had a plan coming up here, Krail said. It was a good plan. For a different mountain, Gideon said. Krail looked at him. Yes, for a different mountain. He took a slow breath. The widow's records. How complete? Complete enough that a county judge would spend considerable time with them. And the shared water claim. You'd file that formally? This week. The Valley families are already talking. They know what they stand to lose if you control the spring, Gideon said. They've always known. They needed someone to hold the ridge long enough for it to matter. Krail was quiet. Down the trail, Gideon could hear the horses moving. Not toward the cabin, moving around, shifting, the particular restlessness of animals that had been standing too long in uncertain terrain. Some of the riders were probably already calculating the distance back to Cutter's Fork, and whether their monthly wages covered what they'd been asked to ride into today. Harmer, Krail said. He's the one who talks to the Delanceys. Yes. If Harmer files a shared water claim with the other families, it goes through county as a community use agreement. I can't challenge that without challenging every claim in the basin, which pulls every dealing I've had under review. He said it like a man reading through a ledger and finding the numbers don't add up. That's not a fight I can win quickly. No, Gideon said. It's not. Krail looked at the cabin, at the roof that still sagged in the middle, the chimney with its old crack, at the small vegetable beds that Eliza had staked out on the south side in March, the first green shoots barely visible in the spring soil. You're going to stay, Krail said, not hostile, just confirming. Yes, Gideon said, and the widow, she stays. Krail nodded slowly. He looked toward the spring again, toward the sound of it, since the source wasn't visible from the yard. He looked at it for a long time, and Gideon let him look, because the looking was part of a man closing a door in his own mind, and that wasn't something you could rush. My grandfather built the channel, Gideonson said. The original one. 3 families in the valley were running cattle before your road came through, and they drew from that spring. He paused. I'm not asking you to give up your claims. I'm asking you to stop trying to take things that were never yours to take. Krail turned to look at him. You know this doesn't end cleanly, Krail said. I step back from this ridge and I look weak. Men I do business with will notice that. Men you do business with will notice that you chose the right fight over the wrong one, Gideon said. A man who can tell the difference between those two is a man worth doing business with. It was the most generous thing he could have said under the circumstances, and he knew it, and he wasn't sure he believed all of it. But he believed enough of it that it came out level and steady was what Krail needed to hear right now. Another long silence. Then Krail said, I want the records destroyed. No, Gideon said. Rusk, they're not mine to destroy, Gideon said. They belong to Eliza Merren's husband. They belong to her. They'll stay with her. And as long as you stay off this ridge and stay out of the Harmer and Delancey claims, they stay in a private place and nobody reads them. He held Krail's gaze. The moment your men cross onto this property again, the records go to the county seat and the territorial newspaper. Krail looked at him. You'd do that, try me, Gideon said. The silence stretched long enough that a hawk appeared above the ridge, circling in a slow thermal above the timber, and Gideon watched it without taking his attention entirely off Krail, and the spring ran on the north face. And the horses moved restlessly down the eastern trail, and Blackthorn Ridge held everything in its particular cold patience. All right, Krail said. 2 words, no ceremony, no handshake, no formal language. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at a number he could live with. He turned and walked back to the trail and mounted his dark bay and said something to the broad-shouldered man that Gideon couldn't hear, and then the column reorganized more slowly than it had come up. The horses still uncomfortable on the narrow approach, and they started back down the eastern trail. Gideon stood in the yard and watched them go. He heard Eliza coming up behind him from the south. She reached the yard and stood beside him, and they both watched the last rider disappear into the lower timber. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. He agreed, she said. He agreed. You believe him? Gideon thought about it. I believe his calculation, he said. The math worked out. For now, he paused. Math has a way of changing when circumstances change. So we stay full, we stay watchful, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. One of them tried to come around the cabin, she said. I know, I put the shot into the rock. I know that too. Was that right? She asked it genuinely, without defensiveness. The question of someone who had made a decision under pressure and wanted to think clearly about it afterward. He looked at her. Yes, he said. It was right. You held the line without crossing it. That matters. She accepted that. The warning shot, she said, stopped him, and it told Krail that his men weren't fully under control. That changed something in him. Yes, Gideon said. Did. He looked at her. You saw that. I was watching his face when the shot echoed back, she said. Something went out of him. Not defeat, something more specific. The look a man gets when he realizes the people working for him are a liability. Gideon thought about all the planning she'd done since October. All the plans that didn't assume anyone else would show up. All the maps she'd drawn on flour sacks in a cold cabin with an unloaded rifle for company. You were watching his face, he said. I watch everything. I know you do. She looked at him sideways. Was that a complaint? No, he said. It was the opposite. The hawk had drifted north on its thermal and disappeared over the tree line. The spring was still running. The morning had aged into something warmer and less gray, actual sunlight coming through the gaps in the timber and catching the new green on the ridge's south-facing slope. "The roof," Eliza said. He looked at her. "The roof still needs fixing," she said. "Before next winter." He looked at the cabin, the sag in the middle. The cracked chimney, flashing his father, had never gotten around to properly sealing. "Yes," he said, "it does. And the water claim needs to be filed. This week. And Boone needs to know what happened here today." "He will." She nodded. She was looking at the cabin with the expression she brought to problems she was working through, concentrating, calculating, already moving to the next thing. Then she looked at him. "You let him walk away," she said. "Yes, you had enough. You could have pushed harder." "I know. Why didn't you?" He thought about it. "Because my father wanted this land kept," he said. Not defended. Kept. He looked at the cabin, the workshop his father had built beside it, the spring sound on the north face. "There's a difference. Defense ends when the fight ends. Keeping something means living with it afterward, making it mean something." He paused. Krail walking away is part of making it mean something. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father would have understood that." He didn't answer. But the tightness that had lived in his chest since he'd opened the first letter in February loosened one more degree and did not come back. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee. We're out of coffee." "I know. Come inside anyway." He followed her in, and the door closed behind them. And outside on Blackthorn Ridge, the spring ran on, steady and unhurried, the way it had run for longer than anyone alive could account for, and the way it would keep running. After all of this was only a story someone told about the mountain. The coffee they didn't have didn't matter much by the second day. What mattered was the silence that followed Krail's departure, a silence that had a different texture than the ones before it. Not the silence of waiting, which had been coiled and watchful and exhausting, in a way neither of them had fully admitted. This was something quieter than that. Something that didn't have a name yet, but that filled the cabin the way warmth fills a room when the fire finally catches properly after a cold start. Gideon spent the afternoon after Krail left walking the eastern approach again. Not because he expected anyone to come back that day, he didn't, but because he needed to do something with his hands and his legs, and the residual alertness that didn't know yet that it could stand down. He collected the 2 deadfall logs he'd repositioned and moved them back to where he'd found them. He left the granite shelf exactly as it was. Some things were worth keeping. When he came back to the cabin, Eliza was at the table, with the canvas bag open in front of her and her husband's records spread out in organized groups. She had a sheet of paper and a stub of pencil, and she was making notes in her small, precise handwriting. He sat down across from her without interrupting. She finished a line, looked up. "The water claim," she said. "I want to get the language right before Boone carries it down to the county seat." "What language are you working on?" "The shared use agreement. The way it's worded determines whether Krail can challenge it in 5 years, when he has a new judge and a new lawyer and a slightly different legal theory." She tapped the pencil against the paper. "My husband was thorough in his records, but he wasn't a legal man. Some of what he wrote is clear, and some of it needs interpretation." "What kind of interpretation?" "The measurements of the spring flow. He took them twice a year for 4 years, same date, same method. That establishes pattern. A county agreement based on documented historical flow is much harder to challenge than one based on a one-time assessment." She turned one of the pages toward him. Columns of numbers in a careful hand, dates running down the left side. "See this, he never missed a measurement." Gideon looked at the columns. "He was a thorough man," he said. "He was," she said. There was no performance in it, no grief display, no stoic suppression. Just the plain fact of it settled. "This will hold up?" he asked. "If Harmer and the Delanceys file alongside us, yes." A community use agreement with 3 supporting families and 4 years of documented flow data isn't something a county judge throws out lightly. She paused. Especially when the alternative is having all of Merren's records about Krail's business practices entered as evidence in the dispute. "You're using the records as leverage even in the filing itself." "I'm using them as context," she said. "There's a difference. Leverage is a threat. Context is information. She looked at him. Krail doesn't have to know which one it is. He looked at her across the table with her husband's careful numbers and her own careful thinking laid out in front of her, and thought about what it had taken for this woman to survive 6 weeks alone on this mountain in October, and then to survive the winter with a man who didn't want to be here, and then to hold a position on a rock shelf with a rifle while a hired man tried to outflank her cabin. He thought about the unloaded rifle she'd pointed at him on the first day, and what it had cost her to hold it steady. "What do you need from me for the filing?" he said. "Your signature on the deed as the primary holder. A sworn statement from you about the November purchase. And if you're willing," she hesitated, which was rare enough that he noticed it. "A letter from you about your grandfather's original channel. What you know of it, when it was built and by whom." "I don't know much." "What you know is more than what's on record," she said. "Which is nothing." He nodded slowly. "All right." She gathered the papers back into order with the efficiency of someone who had been organizing things in difficult circumstances for a long time and had made peace with the difficulty of it. "Boone can carry it down tomorrow," she said, "if he's willing." "He'll be willing," Gideon said. "He's been in this since March. He's not going to balk at carrying papers." She nodded. She started to say something else. Stopped. "What?" he said. "Nothing. Eliza." She looked at him with that particular directness she deployed when she'd decided to say the things she'd been not saying. "I'm trying to figure out what comes next," she said. "Not the legal process. After that. Once the claim is filed and Boone carries the message to Harmer and Krail stays where he is." She looked down at the papers. "I've been planning for the next step for so long that I don't quite know what to do when the next step is." She paused, "just living here." He understood that. He had been standing in front of the same door without quite being willing to open it. "What did you want?" he said, "before all this? Before your husband died and Krail came into it?" She thought about it. "I wanted a working ranch," she said. "Not large. Enough to be self-sufficient. Good land and clean water and enough room that the nearest neighbor was a comfortable distance away." She paused. "We had that. For 3 years we had exactly that. You can have it again. On this ridge?" He looked around the cabin at the sagging roof, the cracked chimney, the gaps in the log walls he'd been meaning to fill since January. At the workshop his father had built, which was structurally sound even if the door hung wrong. At the spring that ran steady on the north face, and the south slope that caught enough sun for a real kitchen garden. "It's good land," he said. She looked at him carefully. "Gideon." "What? Are you saying what I think you're saying?" He picked up the pencil she'd set down and turned it in his fingers. "I'm saying the land is good," he said, "and the cabin needs work. And there's a spring on the north face that feeds the whole basin, which means people will keep having reasons to come up here and deal with whoever is holding the ridge." He set the pencil down. "One person holding a ridge is a stubborn fool. 2 people holding a ridge is a household." She was very still. "That's not a romantic thing to say," she said. "No," he agreed. "Most men would have..." She stopped. "Never mind. Most men would have made it sound better than it is," he said. "I'm not going to do that. It's a hard ridge in a hard part of the country, and the roof needs fixing before October, and we have no coffee, and Krail might change his mind in 2 years when circumstances shift." He held her gaze. "But I'd rather deal with all of that here than anywhere else. And I'd rather deal with it with you than alone." The fire made a small sound in the hearth. Outside the spring ran. The timber held its usual silence. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I noticed. I plan things without telling people. I noticed that too. And I read your father's letters before you arrived." "I remember." She looked at him. "You're still here," she said. "Yes." Another long quiet. Then she reached out and took the pencil back from where he'd set it and made a note on her paper. "The roof first," she said, "before anything else." He felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time and chose not to examine too closely because he was not the kind of man who examined things that were working. "The roof first," he agreed. Boone Casper arrived the next morning as if he'd been waiting just below the ridge for someone to need him, which he possibly had been. He took the papers Eliza handed him and read through them with the slow care of a man who wasn't especially fast at reading, but was determined to be thorough about it. "Water claim language is solid," he said finally. "This section here." He tapped a page about the historical flow measurements. That's smart. My husband's work, Eliza said. Boone looked at her. He was a good man. He was, she said. Boone folded the papers into his coat. He looked at Gideon. Krail's men were back in Cutter's Fork by nightfall yesterday. Word got around fast. They weren't quiet about coming back empty-handed. 3 of them went to the saloon and talked more than they should have. He paused. By this morning, Harmer knew, and Harmer went directly to the Delanceys. Good, Eliza said. There's more, Boone said. The broad fellow, the one who leads Krail's crew, he quit. Handed in his notice at the livery in front of 4 people and rode out toward Billings. He shook his head slightly. Krail's got 6 hired men now instead of 8, and at least 2 of the remaining ones have been asking around about other work. Gideon said nothing. He had expected something like this, but had not expected it quite so fast. What's Krail doing? He asked. Staying quiet, Boone said. Which for Krail is unusual. Man normally has an opinion about everything. Right now he's keeping to his main ranch house and not seeing visitors. A pause. Could be he's thinking. Could be he's planning something else. Keep watching, Gideon said. Was planning to. Boone tucked the papers more securely into his coat and checked the button. Harmer wants to meet. Not up here somewhere in the valley. He said the Prout place would be neutral ground and he could bring the Delanceys. When? Eliza said. Week from now. Gives him time to read through the water claim papers and talk to his people. Gideon looked at Eliza. She gave a small nod. Tell him yes, Gideon said. Boone left. They watched him go down the trail, moving at his particular unhurried pace that covered ground faster than it appeared to, and then they turned back to the work of the ridge. The next 5 days were the strangest Gideon had spent on Blackthorn Stranger, in some ways, than the winter. The crisis had passed, but its shape was still present in everything, like the outline of a fire on a wall after the fire is gone. He moved through the days, doing the practical work the ridge demanded, patching walls, checking the workshop roof, beginning the assessment of what the cabin roof repair would actually require in terms of timber and labor, and the practical work was familiar good. But it sat on top of something that was new and that he hadn't fully processed yet. He was building something, not just repairing. Building. That distinction lived in him in a way he kept bumping into unexpectedly. He would be fitting a log into a wall gap and realize he was thinking about the orientation of it in terms of years, not seasons. He would be measuring the roof timbers and doing the arithmetic in his head, and realize the arithmetic assumed other people, later, who would need the roof to be done right. He didn't say any of this to Eliza. She was doing her own version of the same thing. He could see it in the way she'd staked out a larger kitchen garden than one person needed, and in the way she'd reorganized the workshop storage with a logic that wasn't for one season's supplies, but for continuous use. On the 3rd day, he found her in the workshop with his father's tools laid out on the bench, cleaning them. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. The chisels were starting to rust. Needed oil, I know. Your father kept good tools. He did. She went back to working the rust off a small draw knife with a piece of oiled leather. Came into the workshop and sat on the bench across from her and watched her work. He would have liked you, he said. She didn't look up. You think so? He liked people who were direct, Gideon said. And who kept records of things. He kept records of everything. Wool weights, calf numbers, weather, dates of first frost, dates of thaw. Every year, same method. He paused. Your husband and my father would have gotten along. Eliza set the draw knife down and was quiet for a moment. Do you think about him much? She said. Your father. More lately than I used to. He looked at the tools on the bench. I spent 20 years not thinking about him by choice. Now I'm in his cabin using his chisel, and not thinking about him would require more effort than thinking about him. The letters helped, she said, carefully. Some. He picked up a small hand plane, turned it over. The last one, the one I haven't read yet. She looked at him. I know, she said quietly. I didn't read that one. He set the hand plane down. Why not? Because the others were about information. The property, the spring, where you might be. The last one, she paused, the seal was different. The way it was folded, I could tell it was more personal. I left it. He looked at her. She had read 3 of his father's letters to engineer his return to this mountain. She had left the 4th one untouched because she recognized it wasn't hers. He didn't know what to do with that particular combination of things. He filed it in the same place. He filed a lot of things about Eliza Merren, the category of things that were more complicated than simple and more trustworthy than comfortable. "I'll read it," he said. "When you're ready," she said. "Yes." He stood up. "The roof timber. I need to go up on it this afternoon and do a full count of what's actually failed versus what just looks bad from below." "Take the rope," she said. "The pitch is steep enough on the north side that you'll want it anchored." "I know. You'll do it without the rope unless I remind you." He looked at her. She looked back at him with perfect equanimity. "I'll take the rope," he said. He took the rope. The meeting at the Prout place was 7 days after Boone's visit, and getting down the mountain, for it was the first time Gideon had left Blackthorn Ridge since November. The trail looked different going down than it did going up, wider, easier, the views opening southward into the valley, in ways that were almost startling after months of the ridge's enclosed timber and rock. Eliza walked beside him without speaking much. She had dressed carefully, not formally but with intention. A clean shirt, her coat brushed free of the cabin's accumulated wood smoke smell. She carried herself the way she always carried herself, which was like a woman who had decided long ago that her posture was a non-negotiable. The Prout place was a working ranch in the Middle Basin, the kind of establishment that showed 20 years of incremental effort, without any single dramatic improvement, solid but unspectacular. Everything repaired when it needed repairing, and not before. Thomas Prout met them at the gate. He was a compact man in his 50s with calloused hands and the watchful eyes of someone who had been minding his own business in Krail's Valley for a long time and had developed strong opinions about what minding your own business actually cost. "Mrs. Merren," he said, then looking at Gideon Rusk. "Prout," Gideon said. Inside, around a table that was clearly used for more than eating, sat Thomas Harmerbroad, gray-haired, with his hat on the table beside him like it was another attendee, and 2 men Gideon placed immediately as the Delancey brothers by the resemblance, one older, one younger, both carrying the slightly guarded expression of people who had been thinking hard about what they were willing to commit to. Eliza set her husband's records on the table without ceremony. "The spring measurements are on the top pages," she said. "The flow data goes back 4 years. The language of the proposed water agreement is below that." Harmer picked up the top page and looked at it. The older Delancey, his name turned out to be Russell, leaned across and looked at it with him. The younger one, named Cal, looked at Gideon. "You held the ridge," Cal said. "Krail came up with 9 men. He came up with 9 men," Gideon confirmed. "And he came back down." "He did." Cal thought about that for a moment. "What did it cost you?" he asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious. "Less than I expected," Gideon said, "because we'd prepared for more than we needed." "And because his own men quit," Russell said from behind the flow records, without looking up. 3 of them in Cutter's Fork. Word got around. That helped, Gideon agreed. Harmer set the papers down. He looked at Eliza. "Your husband's records," he said. "The conversations with Krail's people. The threats." "All documented," Eliza said. "Dates, names, exact language where he could recall it precisely." "He was methodical." "He was," Harmer said quietly. Something in his voice suggested he had known Daniel Merren, which was not surprising. The valley wasn't large. "You know what these records mean if they go to the county seat," Eliza said. "I know," Harmer said. "And I know what it means that Krail knows they exist." He looked at Gideon. "He's not going to come at the ridge again. Not directly. Not while you're holding it and the records are in play. But he's not finished either." "No," Gideon said, "he's not." "So what does this agreement actually do for us?" Eliza took back the top layer of papers and found the water claim document. "It establishes a community water right on the spring," she said. "Filed by the Rusk holding on Blackthorn, that's Gideon with the Harmer Ranch, the Delancey family, and the Prout place as co-signatories with documented historical use. Once it's filed and recorded, no single party can sell or sign away the spring rights without unanimous agreement." She looked around the table. "Krail can't buy it from one of us and use it against the others. He can't claim default on one family's share. He can't do what he did to Daniel," Harmer said. "No," Eliza said. "He can't." Silence at the table. The kind that follows something that has been said plainly after a long time of being said only in implication. Russell Delancey set the flow records down. "We signed this," he said, "and Krail knows." "He'll know within a week," Gideon said. "He has a contact at the county recorder's office." That's how he knew about the tax sale on the Rusk cabin. And when he knows, then he makes his calculation again, Gideon said. He's a businessman. He calculated wrong once, at the Ridge. He lost men because of it, not to injury, but to embarrassment, which costs him more. If the Valley families are consolidated on the water rights, attacking any one of you attacks all of you. That's a different calculation than the one he's been making, which was to divide and isolate. Harmer was watching him steadily. "You think like a military man," Harmer said. "I think like someone who's had to figure out terrain," Gideon said. "Whether it's land or contracts." Cal Delancey made a small sound that might have been appreciation. Prout, who had been quiet through all of it, spoke for the first time since they'd come inside. "My father drew from that spring," he said, "before Krail. Before any road to Cutter's Fork. Before the valley had enough people in it to need a road." He looked at Eliza. "Your father-in-law drew from it too, I'd expect. Before your husband." "He did," Eliza said. "That's in the records." Prout nodded. "Then it was never Krail's to claim," he said, "regardless of what he's done since." He looked at Russell Delancey, who looked at his brother, who looked at Harmer. Harmer picked up the pencil from the center of the table. "Where do I sign?" he said. The ride back up to the Ridge that evening was quiet in the way of aftermath, both of them processing what had happened without needing to narrate it to each other. Gideon walked slightly ahead on the narrow sections of the trail, and Eliza caught up on the wider parts, and the valley fell away below them as the light went gold, and then amber, the shadows coming long across the basin. "Halfway up," she said. "Harmer knew my husband. I thought so." He didn't say much about it. "No, I think it cost him something," she said. "Signing that paper. Not in a bad way. In the way of acknowledging what happened to Daniel." She paused. "Sometimes the practical thing and the painful thing are the same thing." He didn't answer. He didn't think she needed him to. At the top, the cabin came into view through the timber, and the spring sound reached them, and Gideon stopped walking for a moment without quite meaning to. Eliza stopped beside him. The cabin looked different from up here, or maybe he was seeing it differently. The sagging roof, which had seemed like just another problem 2 weeks ago, now looked like a problem that was going to be fixed. The staked-out garden on the south side had more green in it than it had that morning, not because of any particular growth in one day, but because he was looking at it differently. Not as evidence of what the place was, as evidence of what it was becoming. "You're doing it again," Eliza said. "What?" "Standing still and looking at things." "I'm thinking." "You think loudly when you stand still," she said. "Your face changes." He looked at her. "What does my face do?" "Something softer," she said, carefully. "Not soft." "Softer, like the decision-making stops for a minute." She paused. "I find it—" Another pause. "Careful, it's not a bad thing to see." He looked at her for a long moment. "I read the last letter," he said. She was very still. "When?" she said. 3 days ago. "In the workshop, while you were in the garden." "Why didn't you—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. You don't owe me—" He talked about the spring, Gideon said. And about the land. Same as the others. And then at the end he stopped, looked at the cabin. He said the thing he regretted most wasn't that I'd left. He said the thing he regretted was that he'd taught me that being alone was a form of strength. He paused. He said he'd been wrong about that he'd spent 30 years alone on this ridge after my mother died and called it independence, and that it wasn't. It was just he stopped again. "What?" she said quietly. "Absence," he said. He called it well-dressed absence. She was quiet. The sun was behind the ridge now, the light going blue-gray above the timberline, the first stars becoming visible in the east. "He was right," Eliza said. "Yes," Gideon said, "he was." She looked at the cabin. "The roof first," she said. "Like we said. And the water claim is filed. And Harmer signed. And Krail is calculating. And the spring is still running," she said. He looked at her. "It always runs," he said. She nodded. They walked the last stretch to the cabin together, and the door opened without complaint because he'd fixed the hinge 2 weeks ago, and inside the fire was low but holding, and the canvas bag hung from the rafter with the records inside, and the 4 letters sat on the shelf above the hearth where he'd moved them after reading the last one. He fed the fire. She hung up her coat. The evening settled around them with the ordinary weight of a day that had contained something significant and was now becoming simply a day that had ended. It was Eliza who noticed first. She was at the window, the one that looked east, toward the approach, and she had gone still in the particular way she went still when something had her attention. Gideon. He crossed the room. Below, at the base of the eastern trail, there was a lantern, moving slowly upward. One lantern, swinging slightly with the motion of a single rider. They watched it for a moment. Not a raid, Gideon said. One man with a lantern is not a raid. No, she agreed. But it's late for a social call. He took the rifle from the rack and checked it and went to the door. Stay inside, he said. We talked about this, she said, and the Remington was already in her hands. He looked at her. Fine, he said, but inside the door, not out. Inside the door, she agreed. He went out to the yard and stood in the dark and waited. The lantern came up the trail slowly, and after 10 minutes resolved into Boone Casper on a horse, which was unusual because Boone almost always came on foot. He was moving with a purpose that didn't quite match his normal pace. Boone, Gideon called. The horse stopped. It's me, Boone called back. Nobody else. He came the rest of the way into the yard and dismounted and tied the horse to the post and looked at Gideon in the lantern light with an expression that wasn't alarm exactly, but wasn't calm either. What happened? Gideon said. Krail, Boone said. Not him coming at you. Something else. He glanced at the cabin, where the door was open and Eliza was visible in the firelight. He raised his voice slightly. Both of you should hear this. They gathered inside, Boone at the table, hat in his hands, working the brim the way he did when he was collecting his thoughts. Krail let 2 more of his hired men go today, he said. Not fired, let go. Paid out their wages, gave them horses, sent them off toward Billings, same as the first one. That's 4 of his 8, Eliza said. 5 now. The one your shot scared off the south slope. He left this morning on his own, apparently. Told someone in Cutter's Fork that the Rusk job wasn't what he'd signed on for. Boone set his hat on the table. Krail's got 3 hired men left. 3. Gideon and Eliza exchanged a look. He's not going to attack the ridge with 3 men, Gideon said. No. But here's the part that matters. Boone leaned forward. He went to the county recorder this afternoon. In person. Filed a formal withdrawal of the water claim dispute on the Blackthorn Spring. He paused. Voluntarily, before the community agreement was even processed. The room was quiet for a moment. Why? Eliza said. Because someone told him the community agreement was already signed and being filed, Boone said. And because he paused, with the expression of a man delivering something he hadn't quite sorted out himself, he told the county recorder, apparently, that the spring had been in community use since before his presence in the valley, and that he hadn't understood that clearly when he began the dispute. Another silence. That's not true, Eliza said. He understood exactly what he was doing. No, Boone agreed, it's not true, but it's what he said. In front of the county recorder, with 2 witnesses present, he looked at Gideon. A man who says that in front of witnesses has made a decision about what the next 5 years of his life look like. It's not a retreat, it's a reframe, Gideon said. Yes. Boone nodded. He's telling a story where he's the reasonable man who stepped back from a misunderstanding. Not the man who sent hired thugs after a farmer. A pause. It won't work forever, but in the short term, it's smarter than fighting. It protects him from the records, Eliza said slowly. If there's no active dispute, filing the records becomes an aggressive act rather than a defensive one, Boone said. He's changed the shape of the thing. Eliza was silent. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, with a stillness that meant she was running through it fast. He's still not a good man, she said. No, Boone said. And Daniel is still dead. Yes, Boone said very quietly. But the spring is secured. The community agreement is filed. And Krail has formally, publicly, in front of witnesses, withdrawn his claim. She looked up. That's on record. Whatever he says about his intentions, the withdrawal is on record. It is, Boone said. She was quiet again for a moment. Then we hold that, she said. The records stay where they are. We don't file them. Not unless he moves again. She looked at Gideon. Is that right? He thought about it. Yes, he said. He's made his calculation. This is what it looks like. We accept the result without celebrating it. He held her gaze. Your husband deserves better than Krail's public relations maneuver. But the spring is free, and the valley families are protected, and that's what Daniel died trying to do. She held his gaze for a long moment. Yes, she said. Her voice was level, and it cost her something, and she didn't try to hide that it cost her. That's what he died trying to do. Boone stayed the night on the floor by the fire, rather than ride back down in the dark, which was practical, and also, Gideon suspected, because the old man wanted to be present for one more morning on Blackthorn Ridge, before the immediate crisis was fully resolved, and the long ordinary work of it began. In the morning, Gideon woke before either of them, and went out to the yard in the early gray light and stood for a while, listening to the spring on the north face. It ran the same as it always had, same sound, same pressure, same indifference, to everything that had happened on the ridge above it and in the valley below it. It had been running when his grandfather dug the first channel. It had been running when his father sat alone in this cabin, calling his isolation independence. It was running now into a spring morning on a mountain that was no longer just a place to disappear. He heard the door open behind him. Eliza came to stand beside him. She'd been up a few minutes. From the sound of it, the fire was already going inside. He'd heard her moving. She didn't say anything. She stood with her arms crossed against the morning cold, and looked east the way they'd both stood, and looked east the morning Krail came. Except that this morning, the eastern approach was empty, and the light was coming in clean, and the jays were calling in the timber without any particular urgency. What do you need first? She said finally. He thought about the roof, the water claim, the wall gaps, the workshop door that hung wrong, the kitchen garden that needed expanding, the trapline he hadn't run in 6 months, the timber on the north face that needed thinning before it became a fire hazard. He thought about his father's tools on the workshop bench, oiled and ready. He thought about a silver dollar sitting in a county recorder's file, somewhere in Cutter's Fork, already part of the record of this place. Lumber, he said. For the roof. I'll need to go down to the valley mill and arrange it. I'll make a list of what else we need while you're down, she said. That'll be a long list. Yes, she agreed. It will be. He looked at her sideways. You're not going to apologize for the length of the list. No, she said. I'm not. He almost smiled. Then he did smile, a small one, the kind that didn't require any particular occasion to justify it. Behind them, inside the cabin, Boone Casper's snoring continued steadily, uninterrupted, as it had been for the past 4 hours, which was its own kind of constant. Gideon turned back to the east and let the morning come in, and Eliza stood beside him, and Blackthorn Ridge held them both in its cold and particular quiet, which was no longer the quiet of a place that had been abandoned, and was no longer the quiet of a standoff, but was beginning, slowly and without ceremony, to be the quiet of a place where people lived. The lumber came up in 3 loads over 2 weeks, hauled by a mule Gideon borrowed from Thomas Harmer, in exchange for a promise of help with Harmer's fence line come August. It was not a clean trade. The mule had opinions about the upper section of the trail and expressed them loudly on each trip, but it was a fair one. And fair trades were the currency that actually held a valley together, which was something Gideon was learning to think about in ways he hadn't needed to before. He started on the roof the first dry week of May. It was harder than he'd estimated, which he should have expected, because things always were. The central beam had rotted through in 2 places he hadn't found from below, which meant replacing it entirely, rather than sistering a new piece alongside it. That added 4 days and required Eliza on the ground managing the rope system while he worked from above, which she did without complaint and with considerably more efficiency than he'd have managed alone. They argued twice during the roof work. Once about the angle of the replacement beam. He wanted to match the original pitch exactly. She thought the original pitch was the reason. The center had collected water and rotted in the first place, and that a steeper angle on the north side would solve the problem permanently. She was right, which he acknowledged after a day of thinking about it and not saying anything. The second argument was about the chimney flashing, which he'd been planning to patch and she thought should be replaced entirely, and on that one he was right. But it took him longer to convince her because the evidence was less clear-cut, and she was not a person who changed positions without clear-cut evidence. They were both still irritated about the chimney when they came down off the roof on the day they finished it. and they ate dinner in a silence that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. More the silence of two people who have been working hard in close quarters and have run out of the particular energy required to be diplomatic. Eliza set her plate down. The angle was right, she said. On the beam. Yes, he agreed. I should have said so sooner instead of making you figure it out yourself. He looked up. I wasn't going to believe you sooner, he said. I needed to think it through. She considered that. That's a gracious way to say I was right. It's an accurate way. Something in her face relaxed slightly, not a smile. She wasn't a woman who smiled as a tension release, but a settling. Like a thing that had been pulled taut, easing back to its natural tension. The chimney flashing, she said. The patch will hold, he said. I used proper pitch, not pine sap. If it fails in 2 years, I'll replace the whole thing then. That's a reasonable position. I know it is, he said. I didn't feel the need to defend it at the time, because I was still annoyed about the beam. She looked at him. We're going to disagree about things regularly, she said. I know, consistently and probably loudly. I know that too. And you're still… She stopped. It was the particular stop of someone who had planned to ask a question and then decided the question was unnecessary. Yes, he said, still. She picked up her plate again. They finished dinner, and he washed the dishes because she'd cooked, and outside the repaired roof, held against a light rain that moved through after dark, and neither of them mentioned it, but both of them noticed. The community water agreement was formally recorded at the county seat on the 14th of May, with Harmer, both Delancey brothers, and Prout as co-signatories alongside Gideon's deed. Boone Casper witnessed it and sent word up the ridge by way of a note tucked into a supply delivery, a single line in his cramped handwriting. It's done. Buy a cow. Eliza read it twice and laughed. It was the first time Gideon had heard her laugh, actually laugh. Not the dry near humor she sometimes deployed in argument, but a real one-short and unguarded and immediately suppressed, like something that had escaped before she could decide whether to let it out. She looked at him, and he was looking at her, and she didn't look away. He's right, she said. We should buy a cow. We don't have a barn. Then we should build a barn. He thought about the lumber situation, the fence repair he owed Harmer, the kitchen garden that needed proper fencing before the deer found it, the trap line he still hadn't run, the workshop door that still hung wrong. Next spring, he said. Next spring, she agreed. The word next sat between them like a thing they'd both been carefully not saying. Next spring meant this winter. This winter meant a second winter on Blackthorn Ridge together, which neither of them had explicitly discussed because explicitly discussing it would have required acknowledging something that was easier to simply continue doing. He went back to the workshop. She went back to the garden. That was the day, although neither of them marked it as such, when Blackthorn Ridge stopped being a place under siege and became a place where people had a next spring to plan for. Krail's formal withdrawal held through May and into June. Boone checked on the situation in Cutter's Fork every 2 weeks and reported back each time with the same essential news, delivered in slightly different form. Krail was quiet, operating his reduced ranching operation without the hired muscle he'd been running before, conducting his business dealings with a notable new caution. He had not approached any of the Valley families. He had not contested the water agreement. He had not, as far as Boone could determine, made any move toward replacing the men he'd lost. He's recalibrating, Gideon told Eliza after Boone's June report. Or waiting, she said. Possibly both. The records, she said. We should make a second copy. He looked at her. In case, she said. Not elaborating. She didn't need to. He helped her copy them. It took 3 evenings, working by firelight, Eliza reading the original pages in her husband's careful handwriting, while Gideon transcribed them in his own rougher hand. It was a strange kind of work, intimate and sad and practical all at once, the way much of the work on this ridge had been. By the end of the 3rd evening, he had developed an involuntary sense of Daniel Merren as a person, thorough, observant, precise in his language, angry in a controlled way that came through in small word choices rather than direct expression. He sounds like you, Gideon said, near the end of the last evening. Eliza was quiet for a moment. In some ways, she said. He was less stubborn. That's not necessarily a compliment. No, she agreed. It's not. She folded the copied pages into their own oilcloth wrapping and tied it with cord and sat for a moment with it in her hands. He would have been glad, she said. About the spring agreement. About the Valley families. I think so. He wouldn't have liked how it was done, she said. Confrontation on the ridge. The rifle work. He was not, she stopped, looking for the word. He was not a man built for that kind of thing. Most people aren't, Gideon said. You are. He thought about how to answer that honestly. I'm a man who knows how to use terrain, he said. That's not the same as being built for confrontation. It's more like he stopped. Knowing the difference between a fight you can win by being aggressive and a fight you can win by being patient and positioned. Most of what happened on this ridge was patience and position. She looked at him. That's what he needed, she said. What I was looking for when I spread word of the tax sale. Not someone who would fight for the ridge, someone who would stand on it. He held her gaze. I know, he said. I understand that now. She put the copied records in the canvas bag alongside the originals and hung it back on the rafter, and the evening settled around them with the particular ordinariness of a life that was, against significant odds, being built. It was Thomas Harmer who first called Gideon by his full name at a Valley meeting in July, not as a greeting but as a reference Rusk up and Blackthorn. He said, explaining the spring situation to two families who had come into the valley that summer and needed to understand the water agreement. He said it the way you say someone's name when you're using it as a fixed point, a landmark. The way you'd say the big pine at the creek bend or the rock formation at the east trailhead. Just a thing that was there and could be counted on to remain there. Gideon heard it from across the room and didn't say anything about it. But he remembered it. He told Eliza that evening. She was quiet for a moment. Is that strange, she asked. To be a landmark? A little, he said. I've been moving for 20 years. A landmark doesn't move. No, she said, it doesn't. I don't think I mind it, he said slowly. That's the strange part. She looked at him with that particular concentrated attention that meant she was taking something seriously. Your father minded it, she said, being fixed to one place. You said he called it isolation, called it independence. He did, and you thought you'd inherited that from him. The need to keep moving. I thought so, he said. For 20 years I thought so. But you hadn't inherited it, she said. You'd learned it. From watching him, she paused. Those are different things. What you inherit, you're stuck with. What you learned, you can unlearn. He thought about that for a long time. His father had driven him away with words he'd never fully repeated to anyone, words born from grief and isolation, and 20 years of well-dressed absence, as he'd called it in the letter. Words that a boy of 18 had taken with him like a stone in a pack and carried without examining for 2 decades, because examining them would have meant stopping, and stopping would have meant deciding what to do with them. He'd stopped on Blackthorn Ridge, not by choice originally. A silver dollar and a frozen trail and a woman with an unloaded rifle had done that. But he'd chosen to stay stopped each day from January forward. That was the accumulation of it. Not one large decision, but 4 months of small ones, each one a day he didn't leave. I should have come back sooner, he said. You came back when you could, Eliza said. Generous. It's accurate, she said. A man who isn't ready to stay somewhere will leave it even if he comes back to it. You needed to be 40 years old and out of roads before you could stay. She paused. I don't say that as a criticism. How do you say it? As a fact about people, she said. We don't arrive at the things that matter until we're out of the things that don't. Usually it takes longer than it should. Usually something has to close the other doors before we see the one we're supposed to walk through. He thought about a frozen trail in November, about a blizzard that sealed the mountain for winter, about the particular combination of bad timing and manipulation and weather that had put him in this cabin at exactly the moment he was finally out of alternatives. Storm, he said. She tilted her head slightly. If the trail hadn't closed when it did, he said, I'd have left. Yes, she said. I wouldn't have read the letters. No, I wouldn't have learned the terrain. Wouldn't have been here when Krail came. No, she said again. You wouldn't have. He looked at her. Did you know the storm was coming? He said. When you told me it was. She held his gaze with that perfect steadiness she deployed when she was being completely honest about something complicated. I knew one was likely, she said. The pressure in the air, the temperature drop. I'd been watching the weather for 6 weeks. I knew the signs. But you didn't know for certain. No, she said. Not for certain. He nodded slowly. But you told me like you did. Yes, she said. I told you like I did, a long quiet. I'm not angry about it, he said. I know, she said. You would have been in January. Not now. What changed? She looked at him steadily. You know what changed, she said. He did. He didn't need to say it, and she didn't need to hear it said, not right now, not in those particular words. Some things between two people establish themselves through accumulation rather than declaration. Through a winter of shared survival and a spring of shared defense and a summer of shared work that was harder and better and more aggravating than either of them had planned for. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand placed. Her fingers were calloused from the garden and the rifle work and the months of cabin life, same as his. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while, by the fire, in the cabin, with the fixed roof and the cracked chimney patch, and the records hanging from the rafter, and the letters on the shelf above the hearth. Outside, the summer dark had come in full, and the spring ran on the north face, and the valley was quiet below, and Blackthorn Ridge held its ground the way it always had, indifferent to human drama, present for human life. The small wooden frame was Eliza's idea. She found a piece of scrap timber from the roof repair, a clean-grained section of pine about the size of her hand, and spent an evening in the workshop with the draw and the small chisel, working it into a proper frame. She didn't tell him what it was for until she was finished, and then she set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. For the dollar, she said. He looked up at her. People frame things that matter, she said. Documents, letters, things they want to keep visible. A silver dollar isn't exactly a document. No, she said. It's something more direct than a document. It's the whole transaction. $1 for this land, this water, this ridge, this, she gestured, taking in the cabin, and by extension, everything outside of it, all of it. That dollar is the beginning of the story. He picked up the frame. She had done good work with it. The joints were tight, the surface smoothed to a clean finish, a small hook on the back for hanging. He went to his coat and found the dollar in the inside pocket where he'd been carrying it since November. He set it in the frame. It fit exactly, which he suspected she had planned. He walked to the hearth and hung the frame above it, on the stone facing, where the firelight caught it in the evenings. He stepped back and looked at it. $1 silver. Bought the loneliest cabin on the northern Rockies, a disputed spring, a dead man's records, a widow with an unloaded rifle, a winter that closed every other door, a spring of rebuilding, and a summer of beginning to understand what it meant to make a life in a place rather than simply occupy it. You paid too much, Eliza said from behind him. He turned and looked at her, this woman who had summoned him home by reading his father's letters, spreading word at trading posts, and holding a rifle she couldn't fire, and planning for every possible failure including his, who had fired a warning shot instead of a killing one, because she'd been listening when he talked about the goal, who kept records of everything and argued about roof angles, and laughed exactly once in his hearing before catching herself, who had turned her hand over and held his without making it into anything larger than what it was. No, he said. Best dollar I ever spent. She looked at him for a long moment. Don't make it sentimental, she said. It is what it is, he said. It is, she agreed. And that was all, and it was enough. The second winter came to Blackthorn Ridge in October, as it always had, without warning and without apology. First snow found the roof holding solid, the chimney drawing clean, the wall gap sealed, the wood pile stacked deep under the eaves. Kitchen garden had been harvested and stored. The workshop was organized for winter work. The water claim was filed and recorded, and as permanent as a human document could be made. Boone Casper came up one last time before the trail closed, bearing real coffee, 2 pounds of it, which he set on the table without comment, and refused to explain the origin of and the news from the valley. Krail had sold 2 of his eastern grazing claims to a family coming in from Colorado. He had reduced his operation by nearly a third, and was, by all accounts, focused on what he actually held, rather than what he might acquire. He had not spoken publicly about Blackthorn Ridge. He had not sent anyone up the eastern approach. He's found his edges, Boone said. Good, Gideon said. Farmers building a proper irrigation channel off the spring runoff. Community project. The Delanceys are contributing labor, Prout's contributing timber. Boone accepted a cup of coffee and held it in both hands. Your grandfather's channel is going to be 3 times the size it was by spring. Gideon thought about his grandfather digging the first channel with whatever tools he'd had before the road, before Cutter's Fork, before any of the families who now drew from the same water. He thought about his father writing letters in an empty cabin to a son who wasn't there, trying to explain something about land and belonging that he hadn't been able to explain in person. He thought about what it costs a person to be alone for 20 years and call it a choice. He had been that kind of person. He had been very close to remaining that kind of person close, enough that one frozen latch, $1, one storm had been the difference. He did not know what to make of that, exactly, except that it made him take seriously the idea that the distance between a life and a wasted life is sometimes smaller than you think, and that the thing which closes that distance is rarely what you'd planned for. It was usually something that arrives uninvited, a woman with an unloaded rifle, a letter you should have read 20 years ago, a storm that closes the trail before you can leave. You do not recognize it as a door until you've walked through it, and by then you're already on the other side, and going back is more work than going forward, and going forward turns out to be what you wanted all along. Boone finished his coffee and stood up. "Staying another winter?" he said to Gideon, in a tone that suggested he already knew. "Yes," Gideon said. Boone looked at Eliza. "You?" he said. "Someone has to make sure the chimney holds," she said. Boone made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He put on his hat and his coat and said goodbye in the way he said everything plainly, without performance, and went out the door and down the trail for the last time before winter sealed it. They stood in the doorway and watched him go. The snow was light and dry, coming sideways on a northwest wind, catching the lantern light from the cabin in small cold sparks. The timber was dark, and the valley below was invisible, and the ridge was becoming what it became every winter. A world reduced to what was immediately present, everything beyond the tree line theoretical. "He won't come back until March," Eliza said. "No. We'll need to check the eastern approach ourselves through the winter." "Every 2 weeks," Gideon said. "Same as before, and the spring," she said. "The intake channel before it freezes over, yes. And the workshop roof. That northwest corner still has." "Eliza," he said. She stopped. He looked at her in the lantern light, this woman who could not stop planning, who had been planning since October of last year when she climbed onto a dying ridge alone and started making maps on flour sacks, who planned as a form of staying alive and had never entirely learned to stop, even now that staying alive was less immediately urgent. "We'll handle it," he said, "same as we've handled everything else. Together and badly at first, and better by the second attempt." She looked at him. Something moved across her fists that she didn't suppress quickly enough, something that was not quite the guard she normally kept. "That's not a very reassuring thing to say," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's the truth, and you don't like being lied to." She held his gaze. "No," she said quietly, "I don't." He put his arm around her shoulders, which was not something he'd done before, and which she received without stiffening. And they stood in the doorway of the cabin with the repaired roof, and the cracked chimney and the silver dollar framed above the hearth, and looked out at the snow coming in on the northwest wind. And neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying. There is a thing that happens to people who spend long enough running from something. They forget, somewhere along the way, that they were running toward something too, even if they couldn't name it. Even if they would have denied it, in the years when they told themselves that moving was its own reward, and that needing a place was a weakness, and that the absence of roots was the same as freedom. Gideon Rusk had told himself all of those things. For 20 years he had maintained them against the evidence of his own loneliness, with the stubbornness of a man who had decided what he was and wasn't going to be argued out of it. He had been wrong, and the wrongness had not killed him, and that was the only grace available in it, that he had been wrong long enough to understand the mistake, and had arrived at Blackthorn Ridge at exactly the moment when understanding it was still worth something. What he knew now, that he had not known in November, was this: a place is not a trap. A place is what you make of the ground under your feet and the people beside you and the work that falls to your hands each day. It is not a limitation on freedom, It is the shape that freedom takes when it becomes something more useful than pure movement, when it becomes a life. He had paid $1 silver for the beginning of that understanding. It remained, as he had said, the best dollar he ever spent. The snow thickened on the northwest wind, and the timber held its dark patience, and the spring on the north face ran under its forming ice, steady as it had always been, steady as the things that matter tend to be when you finally stop moving fast enough to notice them. Inside the cabin, the fire was warm, and the frame hung above the hearth, and Blackthorn Ridge kept its ground the way it always had. This time it was not keeping it alone.